So Ron Klain is our keynote speaker for the lunchtime, and Ron is Executive Vice President and General Counsel for Revolution, LLC. But what he really has been somebody who's been deeply involved in running of our federal government for a long time. He's been Chief of Staff for both Vice President Biden as well as Vice President Gore. And then in 2014, as the Ebola outbreak in West Africa was raging, as Ebola was coming to Dallas, and there was a sense that our government's response was not as optimal as it could be, as it should be, and President Obama turned to Ron to lead the government's response. And what's remarkable to me, and he has since then become a colleague, a mentor, a friend, and it has been really impressive, is a guy who has spent his career working and thinking about how to make the federal government work better and more effectively, has really taken on the cause of pandemics and disease outbreaks as his own, and has made it his own, and has become an expert in a way that most of us who've actually spent our lives thinking about this feel like we don't always understand. So it is a pleasure and an honor. Ron, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Ashish. Thanks for that introduction. We live in strange times where my leaving Washington, D.C. to come up to Cambridge to talk about the possibility that 30 million people could die from an epidemic is like an upbeat alternative to being back in D.C. today. So it's really a real pleasure to be here. I also want to say that, as Ashish mentioned, in 2014 I took over as the Ebola response coordinator. I had no scientific background, no medical background, no expertise in the field. And as a result of that experience, though, I've had the opportunity to speak to groups like this a number of times over the ensuing 4 years. It's always very intimidating for me because I'm the least expert, least credentialed, least experienced person in the room. And I want to thank the organizers of Outbreak Week for finally, my 4 years of doing this, for the first time holding an event in the one building where I have a degree from. I'm actually more credentialed than other people, so it's very good to be at my alma mater here at the Harvard Law School to talk about this topic. You know, we gather in part to commemorate the 100th anniversary of one of the worst mortality events in world history, and the worst mortality event in American history, the Spanish flu epidemic, which killed more people in the United States in World War I and World War II combined. And when I talk to people who are not experts in the field about this, they often assume that because 1918 was so long ago and so much has happened in science and medicine since then, that we're not at risk of a similar kind of pandemic today. And of course, there are a lot of ways in which the progress in science and medicine have suggested, or it suggests that if we faced a similar kind of flu epidemic in the U.S. today, we'd have all kinds of tools. We talked about all morning, different kinds of antivirals and antibiotics that would make it less serious. And indeed, if you think even about the Ebola outbreak in 2014, and the progress that's been made even in the 4 years since then, we're seeing playing out in the DRC now, as scary as it is, as complicated as it is, as much as we're now worried about its possible spread to Uganda and the disease playing out in a crisis zone, all these things, even so, the progress in just 4 years in understanding how to manage the disease, in particular in the introduction of a vaccine and having 12,000 people vaccinated or more in that area, just shows that we are making progress and the world is a safer place in many respects. But I want to focus today on the ways in which the world is a less safe place than it was in 2014 and even than it was in 1918. And I want to talk about how the risk we face here is a real risk. Bill Gates' famous prediction that it's not a nuclear war or a terrorist attack or any other threat but a pandemic that has the highest risk of a single event that could take 30 million or more lives in the next few years certainly chills us all. And, as I said, the good news is the people in this room and your peers and colleagues around the world are doing so much to lower that risk and to decrease that risk. And we're making progress every day on vaccines and therapeutics, diagnostics, tools, data analysis, all kinds of things to make that risk decrease. But there are ways in which the risk of a pandemic is increasing, notwithstanding that progress, and that is my focus here this afternoon. So I'm going to start and move past quickly the one obvious way, the one obvious change in which our risk of an epidemic spread is increasing. I'm going to go past it quickly because it's generally a benign thing, and that is the massive increase in global connectedness due to development in transportation and infrastructure. You know, way back in 1918, there were parts even of this country that never really saw a substantial Spanish flu outbreak because there were parts of this country that were so disconnected from other parts of the country, let alone other parts of the world. They were largely insulated from the spread of the disease. But today, of course today, it's very different than that. It's not just that someone can go from Beijing to Boston in 16 or 18 hours. It's that someone in the most remote village on the planet can get on a scooter and now ride a road to a regional capital, where they can get on a bus or a train and get to a national capital, where they can get on a plane and get to Paris or London, New York, Washington, Beijing, Riyadh in less than 24 hours from any spot of the planet to almost any city on the planet. Before a warning about an outbreak could even appear in the global media, it could be in our schools, our workplaces, our hospitals. Boston may still be the hub of the universe, but it is an infinitely smaller universe than when Oliver Wendell Holmes said that just a few years before the Spanish flu epidemic hit our country. So global connectedness does raise our risk of a global epidemic, but has so many other benefits, exchanges in culture and learning, commerce, education, all these movements of people and ideas, that we wouldn't want to turn back the tide on that, and we can't turn back the tide on that. But what about the changes and trends in the world today that are making us less safe and that are not as positive as global connectedness? And that's my main focus. And my message today about these new threats, as I will discuss them in a few minutes, is that it's a time the global health, security, and the public health communities must get more political, more active in public policy than ever before. Now I want to be clear, I'm not saying more partisan. I'm not talking about a political party thing here, but I am saying that there are controversial and divisive public disputes that need this community to speak out more than ever. The men and women of this community who risk life and limb often to fight disease have to stick their necks out a little farther, not to face down a virus or a vector, but to face down the social and political trends that are endangering our ability to prevent and respond to future epidemics. And there are three particular threats I want to talk to right now. The first is the rising tide of isolationism and xenophobia, a turn inward in many of the world's developing nations, particularly now in the United States and Europe, and a turn away from global engagement. Now, I want to stay away from partisan politics here. I am a partisan, there's no question about it. I'm a very active and vocal Democrat. But when it comes to the issue of pandemics, there is no Democratic or Republican response. There should be no, red or blue answer to this. There should only be, the right and wrong scientific answer. I'm not here to really debate about what would really make America great again. But there is no question, there is no getting around the fact that an America First mindset, leaders who tell us that globalism is bad and that global engagement is not our path, make America less safe when it comes to pandemic prevention and response. The belief that isolating ourselves from the world can prevent the spread of diseases here is foolhardy. There's no wall we can build that's high enough to keep infectious diseases or the vectors that spread them out. We have to be part of a global community that's attacking a shared global threat. Now, we don't need to speculate about how much mindsets have made us less safe. We've seen it already. In 2014, at the peak of the fear of Ebola in the US, a fear that by itself risked cutting off public support in our country for fighting the disease in West Africa, then citizen Donald Trump tweeted that President Obama's decision to medevac back to the United States Ebola fighters who had contracted the disease was, quote, stupid, and that these people should be left in Africa to, quote, suffer the consequences of their choices. Now, had that been the policy of the United States at that time, and not just the tweetings of a provocateur, not only would some heroic people have died as a result, but getting doctors and nurses to go to the front lines to fight this disease would have been infinitely more difficult. And fewer responders would have meant a greater spread of Ebola in West Africa in 2014, touching more countries, killing more people, and ultimately even endangering the United States in a variety of ways. Fortunately, that sort of isolationism was not our policy in 2014. I've had the honor of meeting Dr. Kent Brantley and Nancy Wright-Bull, two people who were medevaced back to this country for treatment and whose lives were saved, and I can assure you they are very much alive and still making the world a better place. Nor is the impact of isolation merely a what-if question. In 2015 and 2016, xenophobic and isolationist sentiments on Capitol Hill played a major role in Congress delaying funding for the Zika response. Time and again, as I and others urged Congress to pass the emergency response package that the administration had sent to Capitol Hill months before the first outbreaks of Zika in the continental United States, and Congress refused to act, I heard repeatedly back to this advocacy, why should we pay for this? Zika is an immigrant's disease. Or Zika isn't a public health problem, it's an immigration problem. Just keep the foreigners out. As a result of the delay in Congress acting, we had the first case of local transmission of Zika in Florida, and the first instance ever of the Centers for Disease Control issuing a travel advisory against travel to parts of the continental United States. America withdrawing from the world makes the world less safe, risks the spread of infectious diseases in all sorts of places, and will cost thousands, if not millions, of lives. It's a humanitarian catastrophe. And if for some reason that isn't persuasive, then let me say this. It also makes America less safe. Our failure to combat epidemics overseas just starts a ticking clock to facing those epidemics here at home. Global health advocates and public health professionals must be at the forefront of facing down this mindset here in the US and around the world. Now, a second threat is the way in which today's communications technology and networks can transmit an epidemic of fear and doubt even faster than the viruses and vectors themselves can communicate a disease. The speed of Twitter, the impact of Facebook, the immediacy of cable television create a mechanism for distributing information, true or untrue, literally at the speed of light. The impact and damage that this kind of communication can do, if it's false or panic-inducing, is really hard to calculate. But it's painfully ironic and thoroughly applicable that we say that these kinds of communications, when they are maximally impactful, have quote-unquote gone viral. Now, I know you devoted a day earlier this week to the issue of communications and epidemics, and I don't want to be repetitive of that. And moreover, I think it is important to acknowledge that for large swaths of the world's population, it is still a lack of communication and not a plethora of messages that poses risks. During the 2014 Ebola epidemic, it was a lack of cell phone coverage in Sierra Leone that was a real barrier to contact tracing in parts of that country, and a lack of broadcast radio coverage in Guinea that slowed our ability to disseminate public health messages there. But in the highly connected developing world, and increasingly in a larger share of the world as a whole, it is the ability of false information to crowd out truthful information, of fear to spread and paralyze, of paranoia and hatred and conspiracy theories to capture the minds of millions that poses a great threat in a time of crisis. Back in 2014, whenever these forces got strong and we risked being overwhelmed by them, my office developed a highly sophisticated and technical countermeasure that went by the initials PTFOT, that stood for Put Tony Fauci on Television. The ability to have a national icon like Tony as a messenger of science and information, of truth and education, was an invaluable asset at critical moments during the Ebola outbreak in 2014. But not every country has a Tony Fauci, and even Tony cannot be everywhere at once. Solving the challenge of hyperconnectedness and hyperinformation is absolutely critical for dealing with the dangers of a future epidemic. Once again, the burden falls on this community to take on the false information, the conspiracy theories, to tackle the Twitter trolls, and to create a communications environment that will permit and promote an effective epidemic response. Third, there is the growing tide of anti-scientific thinking, of a rejection of expertise, and a resistance to evidence-based medicine that is now often associated with the rise of populism in the US and Europe. Tony talked earlier this morning about what we're seeing in Italy right now. And it's particularly manifesting itself with the rise of the anti-vaccination movement in developed nations. Of course, in large parts of the world, it's nothing new for people who lack adequate education or background, or whose culture lacks a disposition to this right framework, to be skeptical of the validity of modern medical measures. But what we're seeing now in large parts of the US and Europe is something very different and very dangerous. The growing refusal of parents to vaccinate their children, well-educated parents with no historical or cultural barriers to explain their resistance, is dangerous and just the tip of an iceberg that could sink us all in the event of an epidemic where rapid vaccine deployment might be critical to public health. This is a political movement that does not uniquely belong to the left or the right. It includes left-wing populists who doubt vaccines because of the corporate status of vaccine makers, and right-wing populists who reach the same conclusions despite the educated elites who promote vaccination. During the Ebola epidemic of 2014, I would often talk to policymakers and explain the challenge of persuading communities in West Africa to adjust their burial practices to reduce the speed of the spread of the disease. And time again, these policymakers would say to me, if only those people could put aside their irrational beliefs and accept science. And each time that happened, I would point out that at that very same moment, in Southern California, here in the US, there was discussion of closing Disneyland because of a budding measles epidemic that was the product of parents in Orange County, California, refusing to vaccinate their kids. If only those people would put aside their irrational beliefs and accept science, indeed. So, in the face of these threats that raise our danger from epidemics, a growing tide of isolationism, the rapid pace of modern miscommunication, and the swelling anti-science populism, what can we do? What can those of us concerned about global health security do? And as I said before, I think the answer is that this community has to get even more political, even more into the policy arena. And as I said, I'm not talking about more partisan. In fact, I thought Heather's presentation this morning about what the Trump administration is doing on trying to combat some of these dangers was great. And I think there are good steps happening there. But, and this is not about one political party or the other. But we do need to match our investments and our focus on research and development, on things like CEPI, on vaccines and therapeutics, with an equal focus on changing heads and hearts and creating the political and social and policy framework where we can improve our efforts to prevent future epidemics and make any future response more effective and rapid. We have to match risk-taking and progress in treatment units and on the lab bench with the same sort of instincts in the public arena and in town square. And so let me close with 3 specific suggestions about my call for a more politically active global health movement in the United States. First, we need to continue to work with policymakers to get in place the legislative and the budgetary measures we need to make sure the U.S. is prepared to respond to future epidemics. This includes a much larger and fully scaled public health emergency fund, a reversal of the recent chipping away of the investments we made in 2014 and 2015 in domestic epidemic preparedness, making sure we have well-funded, well-trained, well-staffed infectious disease treatment centers and first responders. It means changes in the Stafford Act to allow the president to declare a natural disaster arising from an infectious disease outbreak. And most of all, it means a continued U.S. investment in global health security and assistance to other countries that are trying to improve their own response capacities. And we must emphasize that these commitments and these investments must be consistent and long-term, not episodic and crisis-driven. In the end, the best way to combat the dangers of isolationism and xenophobia is to lock in place policies that can overcome the consequences of these ills by institutionalizing and extending the U.S. commitment to combating health security threats around the world. And while advocates like myself can play some role in winning these battles, it's the voices and ideas of true experts like the people here that are absolutely critical. Second, beyond this work here in the U.S., which will have a positive impact here and around the world, we must be the vanguard of building out and improving our global response system. Right now, as everyone in this room knows all too well, when an outbreak occurs in a country that has a weak national health system, the global response relies upon the WHO and a network of courageous and amazing, but nonetheless private and voluntary NGOs. This exceeds the capacity of the former and leans far too heavily on the latter. A hat is passed, government's throwing some money, it is chaotic, it is ad hoc, and if the crisis were truly substantial and posed a global risk, it is insubstantial. and inadequate. Yes, the WHO is doing a better job today with new leadership and more transparency, but as we're seeing in the DRC right now, when it encounters security and political obstacles, it often must cease operations. We need a robust white helmet battalion of responders who can operate globally and power an epidemic response in any country under any set of circumstances. We need better international cooperation and information sharing so that all nations have visibility into what vaccines or therapeutics are being administered in an outbreak response. UNMIR, deeply flawed, woefully ineffective at many points, still may provide a basis on which we could build, or perhaps it's some other structure or organization which would be the right platform for a fully equipped, fully resourced global response program. But I can tell you this, if science fiction ever became science reality, and the Earth was facing an interplanetary threat that might kill tens of millions of people, we would not go into battle with a global regulatory body and a handful of volunteer groups as our front line of defense. So however it is structured, however it is assembled, we cannot square the knowledge that we face a pandemic threat of that significance, and then when that threat arrives, intend that it be met by the WHO and a series of NGOs. Third, and perhaps most fundamentally, scientists and doctors and academics have to be willing to step into the public arena even more and take on the unpleasant and contentious political issues like the public trends towards isolationism, xenophobia, and demagogic populism. I know that many in the scientific community try to avoid tangling with divisive issues, and I understand why. But your voices are needed more than ever to confront these problems. More of you than ever before are needed to speak outside of academic conferences and journals and step into the mainstream press and publications. More of you even need to be on Twitter. The virus that may kill millions may not be one that can be stopped in a lab. It may be the one that we confront as it scrolls past on a smartphone. 4 years ago, as Ashish mentioned, I was a lawyer and a layperson. I was put in charge of coordinating policy and execution of the Ebola response. Lacking any background in the field, I was ridiculed, I was dismissed, I was belittled. The week I was named to the job, the opening sketch on Saturday Night Live featured Taran Killam playing me, providing hugely uninformed, hackish, and horrible answers to questions about the Ebola epidemic. It was pretty humiliating. But fantastic leaders from this community, Tony and Tom Frieden, Nikki Lowry, Raj Shah, and others, took me aside and told me to hang in there and do my job, which really was largely just to help them do theirs. Now, today, I'm telling you that everyone in this room needs to face the criticism and the controversy, the unpleasantness of public life, to step into the halls of Congress, the offices of the executive branch, and the many dimensions of the public arena to win passage of the policies we need to confront the social and political trends that are making global health less secure. Once again, the men and women in this room and in this community must go to the front lines, confront the danger, and help make us all safer. Thank you very much.
That was awesome. Thank you, Ron. So let's, questions for Ron? If people want to come up, and if it's okay while people are coming up, I'm going to ask you a question.
Please.
So one community that you would think would get the harm that comes from isolationism, the risk that comes from disease outbreaks, is the business community.
Yeah.
And they've been big beneficiaries of globalization, interconnectedness, all of this. And yet, when we've seen this political tide change in the last year and a half, 2 years, there hasn't been, at least in my mind, there's been a little rumbling. So the question is, where is the business community in the broader issue? And then to what extent do they recognize that when there is a disease outbreak that is made worse by isolationism, it's their bottom line that's going to be hurt, it's their workforce that's going to be disrupted, their supply chain that's going to get messed up. Do you have any thoughts or sense on where that community is in all of this?
I'm so tempted to say two words, tax cuts. But look, I think that we are starting to see a little more awareness on the business community. Ryan is here from WEF, and I'm working with them, and really an impressive cadre of business leaders from around the world who do recognize this problem. I think that, look, I think when you talk to business leaders, it's not that they don't agree, it's that they have a lot of other things that are pressing, and this risk seems a little remote, a little probabilistic. You know, what are the odds it's going to happen? What are the odds it's really going to affect my supply chain, my countries where I operate, so on and so forth. So I think it's a question of in a lot of free riding, right? A lot of like, well, someone else will worry about it. We'll let someone else like solve this problem. I'm busy like working on my bottom line. I understand that. But I do think it's important that global business groups step up and play a part. It obviously starts particularly with the travel and tourism industry, which is usually the industry that's most immediately hit by these issues, but needs to get broader than that. And so hopefully we will get more engagement, more involvement. I do want to say, I think I absolutely agree with everything she said. On the other hand, I do think we have to recognize the enormous pouring of resources and help that came during the Ebola response from the private sector, whether those were technology leaders in California who wrote large checks to the CDC Foundation, which made a key difference in powering the early days of the response, to the shipping industry, which brought tremendous amounts of personnel and materiel to West Africa to make this happen, to all sorts of other sectors, including the industries in West Africa themselves that largely shut down operations and still paid their workers to get people to go home and not aggregate in a concentrated area. So I think the business community can do the right thing. I think it often does the right thing, but I do think we need more engagement on these broader issues.
Great.
I'd love to hear what you think about the National Biodefense Strategy and the White House's support of it.
Yeah. So I'm trying really hard to be bipartisan today. Look, kudos for putting it out, okay? And so kudos for that. It's 9 pages long. The annex is 20 pages long. Look, I think it's progress that it's out there. I think all the right things are there. The real issue is the commitment there. In the end, the thing could be 9 pages long or 90 pages long or 900 pages long. The question is the budget there? The reality is, a factual, apolitical statement, every budgetary proposal from this administration has included huge cuts in the NIH, huge cuts in the CDC, huge rollbacks of these critical investments. Fortunately, Congress, and again, credit to Republicans on Capitol Hill have stepped up and rejected those cuts. And so, we're not in bad shape. And again, I'll give the Trump administration credit. Though they were a little late in responding to the first outbreak of Ebola in the DRC last year, they did indeed ultimately became the world's largest donor to that response. And very quietly, they are doing a number of very helpful things for what's going on with Ebola in the DRC right now. So, I think it's just a question of trying to, the strategy's great, but in the end, the resources really matter. And Congress has been great on this. The administration less so. Hopefully, if the strategy leads the administration to change direction and propose a budget this coming year for FY19 that really funds these priorities, then I'll be the first person to give them credit for that and to stand up and to applaud that move.
Thanks, Ron, for being a champion on these issues. Much appreciated. I'm Monique Mansour, the MITRE Corporation, formerly with HHS and Novartis. I want to talk specifically about, I know Ashish asked the great question about business continuity. I want to talk about a particular sector that we're enormously dependent on in these responses. We had Merck here last night, a representative saying that they're not sure they could do what they did in the Ebola response again. So when we think about the industrial base, the complex, that's going to be sort of the first responders or the suppliers, if you will, of critical assets, and what your perceptions are of the biopharmaceutical base as a key responder asset capability in biological threats and pandemic response. What are your perceptions about where we are?
Well, look, if someone from Merck said they weren't sure if they would do what they did on Ebola again, that's an improvement from the last time I heard them when they said they absolutely positively would not do what they did on Ebola again. So it seems like they're softening up finally. That's good to see. Look, I understand the attitudes of the pharmaceutical industry about this, and a lot of people poured a lot of money into developing an Ebola vaccine, and virtually none of them got that money back, and maybe in fact in the end none of them will have gotten that money back, and it's hard to know what went wrong there. That is to say, I can assure you no one in the government called every single vaccine maker and said, all of you must drop everything and all of you must now all try to develop an Ebola vaccine right now. But yet that happened, right? And as a result, if you just thought about logically, if you stopped the clock and stepped out of time for a moment and said, wait, everyone's doing this? Like a bunch of people are going to be unhappy when this is over. it was kind of an obvious observation at the time, nonetheless, this unfolded. To me, the bottom line is we need better coordination between the government and the private sector on this. And we need, I thought the question from the floor this morning, Ashis's point about missiles and the government as a procurer and this whole thing, it was an interesting perspective, because it's definitely not our perspective about the way we do vaccines, notwithstanding BARDA and some role there. It's certainly not like the way the folks at the Pentagon work in any way, shape, or form. But I do think, CEPI is a step in the right direction. I think there's a lot of focus around that. I think that having our government leaders, though, really understand that they need a better dialogue with the industry on this to deal with future crises, to make sure we don't have the kind of thing that happened with Ebola, where a bunch of people, companies spent a lot of money that they were never ever going to get back. That wasn't right. That didn't work. We need a process to confront these kinds of crisis events. Notwithstanding, obviously we need what we're doing now to kind of plan and move forward, but there will inevitably be these crises, and we can't have what happened with Ebola happen again.
I'm inspired by your call for policy changes, for us to advocate vocally in politics for policy changes on issues related to pandemic preparedness. Do you have any suggestions for how we might do so without ending up in the same sort of political quagmire as climate change, for instance?
Yeah, look, I think it's a great question, because there is a lot about, particularly what we're seeing now with the anti-vaccine movement, that parallels what happened with climate change, right? There was a time 20 years ago where climate change really wasn't a partisan issue. It wasn't really a divisive issue. Some people were more or less interested in it or whatever, but this strong kind of partisanization of the debate about climate change is a relatively new phenomenon. And you can see scarily vaccines kind of creeping along that same trend line to the same sort of thing. As I said before, Tony referred to what's going on in Italy with, the populist party there really making resistance to vaccines like a major political issue in the country. And you only have to open up Twitter or read the internet to see a lot of the same thing happening here in this country. And so I thought Tony Fauci's point this morning that, we need to confront this in a way that isn't accusatory or further isolating these communities, and really try to make the case to them directly about what's going wrong with their approach and why they're looking at this the wrong way, and so on and so forth. I thought was great wisdom, as always, from Tony, and a great guide. I think in terms of more broadly, what people have to do is talk to their elected officials, both Democrats and Republicans. And again, as I said, I'm a partisan. Everyone knows where I stand. It is what it is. But I will say, during the Ebola epidemic, one of our most helpful allies on Capitol Hill in terms of funding the response we needed was Congressman Jack Kingston, who's he's no longer in Congress, was one of the most conservative Republican congressmen, was the national chair of the Trump for President campaign, and yet came through with the resources we needed to fight Ebola, both here at home and overseas. And so I think, it's mostly about educating elected officials about this threat. It's mostly about trying to make plain the consequences of some of these popular movements towards isolationism and xenophobia and anti-scientific thinking, and really bringing that forward to the public arena. You'll be surprised at how much elected officials and political figures listen to scientists. There's still a level of respect and expertise accorded to this community, and I think if you use those voices to engage in the public arena, you will find an open hearing at least, and I hope progress on these issues too. Thanks.
Ron, thank you very much for speaking today, and for your leadership on sort of issues of global health security over the last few years. The US has been a leader on global health security policy, and it was sort of fitting actually that the US was one of the first countries to undergo a joint external evaluation. The US's own JEE, so this assessment of our preparedness capability, identified that coordination between the federal, the state, and the local levels of government remained a challenge. So, given the context that you set today about that increasing polarization that we're seeing, how do we get the politics of this right, in particular that relationship between the federal government and coordination at the state level for public health security?
Yeah. So, as Ashish mentioned, I was the White House Ebola response coordinator, and for some crazy reason, people said I was the Ebola Czar. And I can tell you, I never felt as un-czarish as when I was trying to deal with state and local officials on matters of the Ebola response. I would sit in my office in the White House, and I would often call state public health officials, and they would assure me that I had absolutely no influence or control over what they were doing, no matter what office I was sitting in, and no matter how close I was to President Obama. And look, we have a highly diffuse, highly diverse healthcare system in the United States. We have regulation at all levels of government. We have a public and a private system. We have for-profit and non-profit players. And that makes dealing with something like an epidemic response really, really, really hard, right? You just can't, I'm telling you, even if you work in the White House, you can't pick up a phone, push a button, and make things happen. That's not the way the American system works. However, it also makes our system really, really resilient, because it means if something bad happens with one place and one set of actors, it doesn't affect others. So let me illustrate the point this way. In the fall and winter of 2014, as we were trying to ramp up the response in West Africa and get more doctors and nurses and healthcare workers to go and fight, this was a very difficult thing because there was no one I could call and say, hey, you need to go, right? I mean, the federal government, we had some people in USPHS we sent over there, but by and large, this was about kind of taking a tin cup and calling healthcare systems, calling different kinds of groups and saying, hey, could you please get a few people to go over? And every week during the response, I'd do this status call with my counterpart in the United Kingdom. And he'd say, well, how's it going? And I would say, well, I made 52 calls. I got like 3 doctors from Kansas, and I got 2 nurses from St. Louis. And I'd say, how's it going for you? He said, well, I called up the National Health Service. They're sending 50 more people over. Wow. You have a much easier job than I have. And it went this way, right? Like the entire fall and winter, right? And I was like, whoa, our system's horrible compared to that. This is a disaster. And then, sadly, one of those NHS nurses came home with Ebola. And the entire NHS the union for the NHS shut down the response. They sent no one else. And at that moment, the beauty of our diverse, diffuse, non-command and control system kicked in. And we were able to step up and send people from all kinds of other places too, because there was no one person that could say yes, but there was also no one person that could say no. So our system is our system, and it's not going to change. And that means there are going to be Democrats or Republicans in the White House, and Democrats or Republicans as state public health commissioners and as local public health commissioners, and so on and so forth. You have the craziness that you had in Dallas when Mr. Duncan got there and got sick, and the person in charge of the response under Texas law was a judge who was essentially the public health commissioner of the county in Texas, Judge Clay Jenkins, okay, who was a fantastic person and did an amazing job, but it would be hard to explain why a state court judge, like if we drew a chart up here, like how epidemic response works in America, and I was like, oh, state court judge, he's the person who decides whether or not Nina Pham's dog needs to be put to sleep because it was exposed to her potentially having Ebola. Does the dog have Ebola? Does the dog bone have Ebola? Does the dog food have Ebola? Like a state court judge in Texas is making these decisions. It's a crazy system, but it is our system, and we need to work in it. And I do think there are ways in which we can cooperate more levels, coordinate more between the levels, and make it effective.
Great. Yeah, go ahead.
So one of the topics that has come up a lot over the course of Outbreak Week, especially in some of the earlier programming, has been the idea of governance and good governance, which is a very broad, amorphous term. But one particular theme that I think falls under the rubric of good governance is trust in government. And one of the things we've seen in public opinion, and not just recently, but actually over decades in the United States and many other countries around the world, is declining trust in all or nearly all social institutions. So this is kind of a two-part question. What do you think is the relationship between trust in government, in particular, I guess trust in the executive branch in the U.S. context, this is also an international phenomenon, and people's willingness to comply with public health guidance, and then secondary to that, if you think this is an issue, are there steps that can be taken to reverse trends in trust and governance related, acknowledging that it's a long-term process and not just something that happened overnight?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's a very, very hard problem. And you kind of jokingly said that during the Ebola response, our secret strategy was PTOFT, put Tony Fauci on television. But having one person who had this kind of history and expertise, widely recognized, served Republican presidents and Democratic presidents, really made him a trusted figure and a trusted voice, and was a really critical aspect of communicating with the public. But that's not really a system. It's not really a plan, right? And so you need to address that. Now, what are the challenges? Well, one challenge really is our media culture. So if you watched TV during the Ebola fear in the United States, while there was an actual epidemic in West Africa and a lot of fear here, the media culture really fed this fear, right? Because I'd watched some expert go on TV and we had this thing with Dr. Spencer, Craig Spencer, who had been fighting Ebola in West Africa, came home, wasn't sick immediately when he came home, found out he had Ebola 9 or 10 days later. The night before he found out he had Ebola, he had ridden the subway in New York. And so the experts would go on TV and they would say, well, can you get Ebola on the subway? And someone would say, it's like incredibly improbable, it's extremely unlikely. And the announcer would say, so you're saying you can get Ebola on the subway? I said, no, I just said it's like unbelievably unlikely, but you're saying it's possible. And he said, well, yeah, I mean, like, if like Dr. Spencer maybe was bleeding and he rubbed up against you on the subway, and so you're saying there might have been Ebola transmission on the subway last night in New York, right? And so, that is kind of our media culture now, right? Which is, a lot of hype, a lot of whatever. Now, what's the antidote for that? And it's something someone referred to earlier this morning, which I really think is a lot of community-based communications. Yes, it's awesome if there's a national figure like Tony Fauci, you can go on national television and reassure people. Fantastic. But the reality is the most trusted communicators on these issues are local community leaders, community scientific leaders, community political leaders, community cultural leaders. In West Africa in 2014, it was often community religious leaders. We had a huge program of trying to persuade imams to go to different remote communities and talk to their followers about burial practices and the need to change burial practices in an effort to prevent the spread of the disease. But I do think that the best antidote to this kind of rejection of expertise and rejection of authority is community leaders. People may not trust the folks in Washington anymore, but they do tend to trust their local leaders, their local clergy, their local elected officials, their local community icons, whatever. And so they have to really be the key communicators on a lot of this stuff. They play such a key role in this.
So I have to say, I was one of those public health people who I got that exact thing on the subway right after. And ultimately, the tactic I switched to was not talking about probability, because I don't know how to talk about probability, but talking about my kids and saying, I would be fine with my kids riding the New York City subways today. And trying to make this much more personal as opposed to, because literally somebody cornered me into, would you be comfortable on a plane? And I said, sure, I'll be on a plane. And they said, is there no chance? I said, well, there's not no chance. Yeah. And then as soon as I said that, I was done. Because essentially I was saying was everybody was exposed on the plane and they're all going to get Ebola. Yeah. So it's an incredible communication challenge that those of us in the public health world have not been trained in how to deal with. We talk in probabilities, this is low likelihood. There's a 1 in a million chance. Well, that sounds high to some people. Yeah. Thank you for this. Thank you for coming. Thank you for all of your leadership over the last 4 years. And thank you for your call for us to get more engaged. This was awesome.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you.